Hello there and welcome to Corey Loses for another Thrawn's Revenge news video. We are working on Thrawn's Revenge 3.0, but this video is going to be talking a bit about what's going to happen in 3.0 as well as into the future. We're going to be taking a look at all of the factions that we plan to add at any point in Thrawn's Revenge. If you are familiar with the mod in its current state, the playable factions that we have currently are the New Republic, the Empire of the Hand, the Eriadu Authority, Pentastar Alignment, Warlord Zinj, Corporate Sector Authority, and Greater Maldruud. You can kind of reduce these into four major faction groups with the New Republic, the Empire of the Hand, the Corporate Sector Authority, and then all of the Imperials, since Warlord Zinj, Pentastar Alignment, Eriadu Authority, and Greater Maldruud are all kind of Imperial sub-factions. One of the things that's really interesting about the post-Endor period in Star Wars Legends that the mod covers is that there are so many factions that are vying for control, and we want to take advantage of that with how we structure the mod. So before we get started, there are a few limitations that Empire at War does have with faction slots. If you have more than 21, the game crashes on startup, and each faction is coded as its own thing. It's not a map limit, it's an overall limit within the game. If you have between 17 and 21 factions, if you invade factions in slots 17, 18, 19, 20, or 21, there is a chance that the game will crash. So effectively, we have 16 main slots to work with. Although we do have to keep neutral and hostile in mind. These are game function based ones. Hostile is a little bit different, not as necessary, but neutral is what everything belongs to when a real player doesn't own it. So it may just seem like it's not owned, but it really is its own affiliation within the game, and it's something we have to work around. With hostile, we think that we can put it in the 17th slot as long as we don't have anything owning it on the galactic level. So we should, hopefully that means, have 16 slots minus neutral, which means 15, and then there's the Independent Forces faction. This faction allows us to represent other groups that may not make the cut for the top 14, but we do want to represent on the map, and there's some different stuff we can do with that we'll get to a little bit later. So we have 6 more slots to use for factions, and we intend to use all of them. We're also going to have to remove one faction, but I'll talk about that at the end. There are a few main factors that we consider when trying to make our list of what the top 14 factions to represent in the mod are. The first is probably the most obvious one. Which factions were the largest and most powerful at any point during the period the mod covers? This also includes prominence within the story, so the Empire and New Republic would fit from that as well. The next criteria is what they have to offer as far as a unique faction, and there's a few different elements that this includes. So first off, can they have a unique roster or something approaching a unique roster, even if there's a little bit of overlap for its ships, vehicles, infantry, because we want every faction to play differently. The other element of this is what we can do with them on the galactic level for things like their government style. We've talked about how we want every faction to have a different set of mechanics for how their government works, which can influence how they proceed throughout the game, what their goals are within the game, and essentially what they can offer a player through different playthroughs of the mod. Because if a faction is going to be doing the exact same things, usually it means that they're not really worth their slot. The final main criteria is what the faction offers in terms of story events. So if some factions match on kind of the first and second criteria, where we could make them have a unique roster, unique enough government style, they're relatively powerful within the period, but one allows other ways for us to give story events within the mod that give the player something to do and something to look forward to as they progress throughout the game as someone else, that'll give the faction that offers that a bit of a leg up over the other factions in question. So again, there are a lot of other options that we had to kind of pass aside here. The biggest examples tend to be Imperial Warlords, because with such limited slots, we don't want to just saturate the mod with Warlords, since they might satisfy the powerful criteria, but they don't necessarily meet the criteria for offering something unique or offering much in the way of story, though there again are already 5 Imperial factions that we'll touch a bit on that later. I should also point out that the game does not make a distinction between playable and non-playable faction slots. You still get the same number whether the faction is playable or not playable. The way that we basically approach these factions is we start by introducing whatever amount of content we get done, and they'll start off as non-playable factions. Then as each faction gets gets fleshed out more, they get to a point where we're able to make them into a playable faction. So with all the factions I'm going to talk about, we are going to start, or even have already started, on the non-playable versions of them, and then they're going to slowly work up into becoming playable factions over time. We essentially want to make it so that if the mod ever had to stop for whatever reason, that there's no set of content that's fully incomplete, it's just there's different breakpoints for where everything can and will be left for each release. It also means that any faction we decide to give a slot in any way is also a candidate to become playable over time. This also means that we don't intend to fully finish one faction before moving on to the next. We're basically going to be doing the content in an order that makes sense and allows us to flesh out different mechanics within the mod and different scenarios within the mod, though there is an order in which they are likely to turn up as playable, and that's the order I'm going to talk about them in this video. First up, we have the faction most likely to be the next playable faction, the Hapans. This is a group of former space pirates that inhabit the Hapes cluster and formed the Hapes Consortium, who have largely stayed isolated from the galaxy for thousands of years, with some limited contact. We've already put a lot of work into developing their roster, and they're a faction that if you have played the mod, you're probably fairly familiar with. They've been around as a non-playable faction for a long time already. They are hopefully going to start being playable very soon, and with all of these factions though, we want to start making sure their government styles are done before we ship them as playable. Or not necessarily done, but at least have the basic components. For the Hapans, this will mean managing the relationships between yourself and the various royal houses. Getting more favor with different houses will grant you access to powerful commanders who can make your fleets quite strong, even if they are fairly small. As a faction, they're going to rely mostly on smaller ships. This, again, is the faction that we have put the most work into so far, and should end up being playable next, though it is possible, depending on how certain things go, that other factions may overtake them. Again, this is just a kind of hypothetical, estimated release schedule for them. The next up is a faction that is somewhat present on the map already, although in very limited ways, the Hutts. The Hutts are interesting because they're one of a few factions that have the chance to appear not just in Thrawn's Revenge, but also Fall of the Republic, Revan's Revenge, and even a Galactic Civil War mod. They've been around for tens of thousands of years as a galactic power, but a lot of their power gets expressed economically rather than militarily. They are a faction which is going to essentially start out in cartel form, but a big part of their government and the way you interact with them as another faction is going to be the chance that they start to actually rearm in the way that they did after the Yuuzhan Vong War in Legends. So the Hutts, much like another faction we're going to get to later, is kind of a binary faction where you have the earlier phase version of them, and then when certain criteria are met, they can become the Hutt Empire version of themselves, which is a lot more proactive on the galactic level and has much larger fleets. A lot of people would think of the Hutts in Empire War mods and think that, okay, we're just going to take a bunch of Clone Wars assets. But the Hutts actually have a lot of their own ship types, and crucially, they have a very distinct art style. So in the few places where we may have to fill in some gaps, which really aren't that common, we will be able to pretty easily make up new designs for them. There are some ships that we know names of, like the Cossack class, which we were able to already make a design for, and which you should see in the next release of the mod. There are also larger ships like the Dorbula, the Chalandion, the Batil, and the Tirada, which show up in especially the Essential Guide to Warfare, but also other pieces of media. And there's some earlier ship types that tend to fit similar art styles. Star Wars Galaxies introduced a bunch of fighter types that were used by them in their cartel form, but those will also transfer over into the Empire version of them. As each of these factions gets developed more, we are going to have individual videos covering in more depth what each of them is going to do. This video is more just to provide a rough overview of what everything is going to look like as we go through the mod. Next up, we have a faction that has a pretty unique relationship with an already existing faction within the mod, the Chiss Ascendancy. At first, this faction will be more of a kind of Empire of the Hand sub-faction as far as it gets presented, because the units we're going to be using for the Chiss will be a subset of the Empire of the Hand units that we designed as kind of Chiss sourced. So the Phalanx, the Syndic, the Intigo, the Froro, the Prolipsi, and a few others. As we develop the faction, by the time that it's its own playable faction, we have fleshed out the faction with a few more ships of those type that are entirely Chiss. So there will be some overlap between the Chiss and the Empire of the Hand, but it won't be full copies of each other like some of the Imperial factions tend to be. Their government types will also be fairly different, where the Empire of the Hand is obviously in existence to be a lot more proactive in the galaxy, whereas the Chiss are a lot more restricted in how they want to deal with the rest of the galaxy. Part of the government style for each of them will be a relationship with each other that is somewhat similar to the relationship between the CIS and the CIS sub-factions like the Intergalactic Banking Clan, Trade Federation, etc. in Fall of the Republic. We're not 100% sure what in-game feature we're going to represent this. There's a few options for how we can present allied factions, but that will be a problem for us to talk about later once we've had a bit more time to experiment with, I think there's 3 options that we really have there, but either way. The Chiss are going to be another of the factions that start showing up in the next couple releases, probably under 3.0 with Chilla, a few units. They'll still be non-playable at that point, but we'll start fleshing out their relationship with the Empire of the Hand in that release. Next up, we have one more standard-ish faction before we start to get to the kind of weird ones, the Corellians. The Karelians occupied a somewhat unique position in the former Imperial territories, where they kind of quickly threw off direct Imperial rule, and they became an independent but somewhat still Imperial-aligned power under the Corellian Diktat. The New Republic mostly left them alone, although they had strong ties to the system, and it wasn't until about 12 ABY that the Corellians actually joined the New Republic. Even after they joined the New Republic, though, there were individuals like Thrawn and Sal Solo who were pushing for a once again independent Corellia, and under the Second Galactic Civil War, about 30 years after joining the New Republic, the Corellians did break off and form their own faction with a bunch of other allied powers from around the galaxy. So kind of like the Hutts, the Corellians are going to be a multi-phase faction rather than tying directly into the era system in the way a lot of other factions do, with how they start off being dependent on what area you're starting in. So the Corellians will have a version of themselves that is more of the Imperial style, with the Diktat in charge, though they'll have a lot of their own unique ships, and then there's going to be the version of them that can break off from the New Republic or just form the Corellian Federation anyways, and there's going to be a lot that ties in with other planets and other groups with how they end up looking with that. They're a faction that really ties into that final criteria I was talking about for choosing factions, where they offer a lot in terms of story and a lot of mechanics that they can tie into, making the galaxy more interesting for other people. As the New Republic, if your influence on certain planets, especially Corellia, gets too low and someone like Thrawn and Sal Solo takes over, you could easily find yourself facing a crisis leading to a civil war. Or if the Corellians are left alone as an independent force for too long, then they could also form the Corellian Federation under different circumstances, but still with similar results. A lot of the other kind of crisis factions, which the Hutts could kind of be considered one, tend to come from outer regions of the galaxy, whereas the Corellians are pretty much directly in the core, and they have a lot more that ties into the government mechanics and influence rather than some of the different factors that lead to, for example, the Hutts rearming, or the next factions I'm going to be talking about, all 3 of which are kind of treated as endgame crisis factions when you're not playing as them. First up, we have the faction that everyone probably thinks about when they hear endgame crisis in Star Wars, the Yuuzhan Vong. This is a faction that we have been planning for a long time and deciding how to implement within the mod, or at some points even considering making it its own mod, but we think they offer the most when we make them something that can tie into the game as it exists. There are going to be different conditions that can lead to a potential Vong invasion when you're starting in the currently existing progressive Galactic Conquest, but there will also be Galactic Conquest scenarios that are set entirely around the Vong War, just like there will also be Galactic Conquests that are set up entirely around the Second Galactic Civil War with the Corellians once the Corellians are fully established. So we have a couple Yuuzhan Vong assets ready already, and first they'll probably start showing up in more Easter egg situations, but as they get developed, they'll turn into something that can come and ruin your day if you haven't prepared properly for them. Rather than just spawning a bunch of units on the map, we want to tie this into more the way that the invasion actually happens, so we're not just going to be dumping 1,000 units on Helska 4. You'll be able to get some information about whether or when it's happening. If you build certain installations, there will be a chance for it to happen at different points, and there will be some factors that feed into this. So rather than just being like a pure random event or a pure fixed event, there are different things that can happen depending on how the game is progressing that can lead to Yuuzhan Vong invading earlier, later, not at all. It's just something that'll give you more of a reason to build up your infrastructure when it seems like you're winning the war against other powers. They're also interesting because they provide a very different way that we could handle unit production and acquisition, as well as the relationship between planets in the faction. So this is going to be something that really gets fleshed out more as we go, and we'll definitely have more news posts and videos explaining how the Vong will work as that gets set up. The next invasion faction is a little less iconic, but still popular and still fairly unique, the Ssi-Ruuvi Imperium. This is a faction that we've had represented in our mod for Sins of a Solar Empire, Ascendancy, for a fair amount of time now. As a faction that exists within the Unknown Regions, they can provide an early game challenge for the Empire of the Hand that means that they're not just going to be able to control the entire Unknown Regions along with the Chiss, before they can lead to invasions within the galaxy, even on maps that don't necessarily include the Unknown Regions. So they can provide a somewhat challenging but less overwhelming than the Vong early game crisis event. And again, a lot of this will actually scale on difficulty, so if you're really afraid of these coming and ruining your day, but you're playing on like easier or something, then you don't have to worry about them as much. This is more ways that we can keep the game engaging as it goes on and shake up what happens on the galaxy map a little bit. On top of being dinosaurs with a pretty unique art style, the Ssi-Ruuvi have a technology called entekment, where they are essentially enslaving the populations of the planets that they take over and using their life energy to power the units. So this provides a different way for them to interact with the economy and how ships work, much the same way that the Vong do. And this is one of the reasons that they are worthy of a slot, even if they're somewhat less powerful than some other options might be. There's a lot of unique stuff that we can do with the Ssi-Ruuvi, and we're really excited to get them in, hopefully sooner than later. Kind of like the Chiss and the Hutts, they'll start popping up on the map as a non-playable faction or a raid fleet, or even a pretty basic invasion event, and then we're going to flesh them out a little bit more. Our final invasion event is going to be the Killiks, or the Dark Nest. The Killiks are another faction that is multi-phase within themselves rather than directly interacting with the Era system, and much like the Vong and the Hutts, they'll have different factors that lead to them turning into the Dark Nest rather than just being the more passive colonies that will usually exist. Because they're a hive mind that gets tainted by the Force, the way that we can interact with the different nests that make up the Killik colonies is actually somewhat more like an insectoid Hapans style of government. And there's a lot of unique options that brings us. We fully expect that the Killiks will not be one of the more popular factions to play as, but we think that what they offer on the galactic level brings a lot more to the other factions and provides a niche but unique experience for people who do want to play as them. Our goal with a lot of these factions isn't to make every faction appeal to every player, but to make sure that everyone has a faction that plays a unique way that they really like. Hopefully everyone will get some enjoyment out of playing all the different styles, but ultimately we don't want to clog up the mod with too many similar factions when we have these opportunities to do different things. To that end, we have one more faction to discuss before the video ends. Unfortunately, because of the limitations on faction slots, we will likely have to remove one of the existing playable factions. Because of this, we've decided that if we have to cut something, it should be a warlord, and the warlord that it makes the most sense to cut is the Eriadu Authority. They will still be represented in independent forces, which we're going to talk about in a minute, but ultimately the things that make the Eriadu Authority unique within the mod are things that we gave them. Every hero they have is essentially someone that we can put in other places in the mod just as easily, and every unit they have that's unique is stuff that we gave them because of what we wanted the faction to have, so they can be reshuffled into other parts of the mod. There won't be a single unit or hero that's lost from the mod by them not being playable, and it also solves some issues in the early parts of the game where the New Republic can often just be crushed, especially when the player's not playing as them. This again does not mean we are just handing over that entire part of the galaxy to the New Republic, which is what some people have expressed concerns about when we have talked about this before. The planet Eriadu is still going to be held by the Eriadu Authority as part of the independent forces, along with a couple other planets around there, and there are obviously going to be other factions active in that area. The Ssi-Ruuvi are going to be more of a southern faction, the Hutts are as well. There has, for some reason, been some rumors going around that the Eriadu Authority is being removed with this release, but that is not the case. The Eriadu Authority will not be removed until we get to the point where whichever is the final faction starts to get worked on, because we don't need the slot until then. This could be years off, and this could also never happen depending if the mod dies before then. And again, the independent forces will still include planets and units for the Eriadu Authority. The independent forces are a faction that takes up a faction slot but represents a bunch of different factions. So they are where factions like Eriadu Authority, the Yavitha, or the Duskin League, who were a former playable faction that we had to cut for similar reasons, and Mandalorians, that's all where those groups go. They can basically represent as many other groups as we want. We can also make them active in different ways. So just because a faction is not making the cut as a playable or non-playable faction, or a standalone faction if you will, they can still be represented in a way that can make them a challenge and have some events related to them. The Black Fleet Crisis, for example, has recently just been having those planets unlock with Duskin League units on them, but now in 3.0, those units will actually be able to actively try to attack territory, and similar things will be done with Eriadu when that happens. There's going to be a pretty big variety of units, heroes, and different forces that will be within the independent forces, depending on scenarios, depending on the planets that they're meant to represent. So there's a lot of other smaller Imperial warlords that we're able to represent with them in the unknown regions. There are groups like the Rakata that we're actually able to represent with them, who were still technically around and had small amounts of territory at this point. So we can use a lot of this stuff to represent those forces and still do some of the factions that don't necessarily warrant a playable slot for themselves. We understand that it may be disappointing for some people that a faction is getting cut, but ultimately we make the choices we do to make the mod as good as it can be in the end. A lot of the people probably wouldn't have heard of the Eriadu Authority before they played them in the mod, and the things that you like about the Eriadu Authority are things that we gave to them, essentially. We're hoping that by not having to dilute the Imperial content among quite so many factions, we'll be able to make the Imperial factions that are still around, which again is still 4 of them, which is almost a third still of all the factions in the game, they'll be able to have more unique units because of the extra assets we'll have access to from not having to spread them among 5 factions. We'll be able to tie them together with the legitimacy mechanics and the government mechanics in ways that are a lot more interesting than what they exist as now, and the opportunities that we have by having another slot for a faction that is a bit more unique is something where we hope you guys will play it and then understand why this was ultimately the best choice in the interest of the mod. The faction limitations that we found are unfortunately a relatively recent thing that we found, only like 2018, where we found out about the crashes on Invasion, and that's why the Duskin League, who had previously been a playable faction, were removed. We can even still represent a lot of these factions using other factions within smaller galactic conquests and scenarios, as we currently do with the Kutric Hegemony in the Isard's Revenge GC. So we could still have a galactic conquest set in the southern part of the galaxy, where when you pick the Imperial faction, you're playing as the Eriadu Authority, or using the new historical settings, we'd be able to put them in a galactic conquest like that. Same thing goes with the Duskin League, where we might be able to bring the Black Fleet Crisis Galactic Conquest back using the Imperials as the Duskin League for that one as well. This is a plan that we've been talking about in the Discord for quite some time, so there has been some response that, I don't like this other faction that you're planning to do, so just don't do them, and then you can leave the Eriadu Authority. But frankly, if we were to make a full list of all the factions that we were considering for these slots, the Eriadu Authority wouldn't be the next choice in line. It's not like we just cut one and Eriadu Authority slides back up. There are groups like the Avitha, the Vigari, Nuso Esva's faction that would probably take priority over them. Maybe even the Nagai or Toph, because they are offering more unique for the mod rather than a 5th copy of a faction that already exists. So again, we're trying to bring as much unique content to the mod as possible, and stuff that offers different ways to play that isn't already represented by other things. So that should give you hopefully an idea of where we're headed with all of these factions. Again, this is not going to be a short-term amount of work. This is all going to be over the course of probably years, but you'll start seeing a lot of this, especially in non-playable form, over the course of 3.0 and subsequent releases. So we hope you're looking forward to playing all these factions and playing against all these factions as much as we are. And if you have any comments about any of this, you can feel free to leave them in the comments on this video or to join our Discord, which is linked in the description. If you want to keep track of other news for the mod as we go through development, you can subscribe to this channel. I do pretty regular preview playthroughs as well as news posts for the mod covering different mechanics here. But thank you for watching, and hope to see you next time.